Carroll needs to step down as the coach of the Raiders. Maybe not today, maybe not till the end of the season, but it is now abundantly clear that Pete Carroll is not going to be the answer for what long-term ails this franchise. And you know me, Caroline, at this point, I think it's fair to say that I am not overreactionary or a shock jock. And I think you also know that as we came into this season, my expectations were that the Raiders would be a 7-win team. I didn't come in calling for the playoffs. So when I say this, I'm not saying this because wild expectations weren't being met. I'm saying this because the timeline no longer meets the coach's timeline. It's really simple. When you have a coach who admittedly on the mic at the podium this week said that they're further behind 7 games in than he expected they would be, my question becomes, what's the real rebuild look like? It's obviously not Geno with Chip Kelly. It's obviously not working this season. So now you got to look at it and say, okay, are we going to draft a quarterback? Are we going to bring in an all-new offensive coordinating staff? Are we going to bring in an all-new offense? Are we going to start this glorious rebuild process? And if you do that, how do you do that with a coach that's already the oldest coach in NFL history to stand on the sideline during a game? There's no way in my mind, if you're starting a real rebuild, which I believe takes 2 to 3 seasons, Pete Carroll won't be around to see the end of it. So the sooner you figure out who's actually going to run your team for the next 10 years through this rebuild process, the better for the organization.
I'm going to challenge this for a second. As somebody who is not nearly a shred as invested into the Las Vegas Raiders franchise as you are. Have you ever had a friend who has been, dating a bunch of different people, and every time it's like, okay, this guy is bad, this guy's bad, this guy's bad. And it's like, after a while, is it the people that you're dating that's the problem, or are you the problem? When you have enough of a sample size of somebody swinging and missing at something, eventually you have to look in the mirror and say, maybe it's something that I'm doing. Because you say, Pete, not you, but the tweet that was pulled up earlier said that Pete Carroll is the worst head coach in the Raiders franchise. Well, the Raiders have had some doozies of head coaches, whether it was Antonio Pierce or the Josh McDaniels experiment in recent history. The Raiders have swung and missed at the head coaching position. So is this a Pete Carroll problem? Pete Carroll, who has won a Super Bowl, won a national championship in the college ranks, who is very, very well respected in the National Football League. Is this a Pete Carroll problem, or is this a fundamental Las Vegas Raiders organizational problem?
It's clearly, absolutely a fundamental Raiders problem. I don't shy away from that at all. Like, frankly, you mentioned Josh McDaniels, Antonio Pierce, and now Pete Carroll over the last few years. The answer isn't any of them should have been kept or should have gotten more time. The answer is none of them should have been hired in the first place. And you are right, as I say all the time to fans of teams that suck, what do you do when the person ultimately in charge of hiring is bad at identifying talent? That's what Mark Davis has been for the majority of his time as the owner of the Raiders. He deserves a ton of the blame at his feet, but you can't do anything about that. So you just have to keep taking a stab at the apple. And frankly, I don't necessarily see all of this as a wild indictment on Pete Carroll. I think the problem is when you can't match up the timelines, that becomes an issue. Now, I have heard directly from people I know that were in the locker room and from people around the locker room horror stories about the way Antonio Pierce ran his organization fundamentally from top to bottom. I've heard things about Josh McDaniels that made it clear that he never should have gotten another opportunity to coach a day for the Raiders. So when I stack all of that together, it's not about, well, you keep pulling the plug too early. It's about you keep identifying the wrong person. But what do you do now? Like, Caroline, this is a very real stat. The Kansas City Chiefs on Sunday had as many first downs, 30, as the Raiders ran offensive plays in the entire game, 30. Like, when you are that broken, you just don't, like, it's not going to fix it.
I don't mean to laugh.
No, it is.
But that's
like,
ridiculous.
I laughed in the fourth quarter. I literally was just looking at the TV, laughing as the game was going on. How do you get to a situation where, Nate Tice points it out there, that 30 plays run against the Chiefs, fewest amount of plays an NFL offense has run in a game since at least 2002. Chip Kelly is the highest paid offensive coordinator in the NFL at $6 million per year. Geno Smith was handpicked by Tom Brady, John Spytek, and Pete Carroll together to come in and be the quarterback. Chip Kelly was handpicked by that same triumvirate to come in and be the offensive coordinator, and none of it is working. Like, you don't get to this level of suck and then just dig your way out. This season's lost for the Raiders, and that's
Yeah.
fine. The question just becomes, how do you make it any better next season? And I don't see where Pete Carroll is going to be in this thing long enough to turn it around. If he was 10 years younger, great. Let Pete Carroll
Mhm.
keep trying to figure it out because he's Pete Carroll. But he's not 10 years younger. So you got to figure out who's actually going to be here to see the future quarterback and the future offense of the Raiders.
I think timelines are incredibly important, and you pointed that out. Timelines and alignment, because it is clear and obvious Geno Smith is not the guy for the Raiders. That has been incredibly clear from the jump. So the Raiders will likely have a top 5 pick in this upcoming draft. I think the idea is that the Raiders find ideally their quarterback of the future in this upcoming draft. But to that point, do you want Pete Carroll and Chip Kelly to be coaching that quarterback with the understanding that Pete Carroll is probably going to be gone within the next 2 years? And maybe that's even a fair and generous timeline.
And
Timeline
Caroline,
alignment is important.
that's malpractice if you do that to a young quarterback. That is
It is.
malpractice because we say all the time, what you shouldn't do is put a quarterback in a revolving door where they're learning new systems every year. If Pete Carroll's only going to be around for a year or two of a new quarterback, even if you thought Chip Kelly was going to be the coach in waiting, you're still taking the chance that there's an all-new offense for whoever that young quarterback. That's malpractice. You got to bring, if you're drafting a quarterback in the top 5, you have to bring in all new everybody that are all starting from day one with that quarterback.
I think that you do have to clean house, because I think you bring in a GM and the GM hand selects his head coach of choice. That head coach then selects their quarterback of choice. Like, I think that kind of lineation of power is important within a front office and organization. You don't bring in a coach, then you bring in a GM and you hope that the GM and the coach mesh, and you don't draft a quarterback and hope that your next coach likes that quarterback and can work with that quarterback. No, 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 no. It starts at the top. You bring in a GM who selects the coach, who selects the quarterback. That is the timeline that I think makes sense. And sometimes you bring in a quarterback, like I'll use the Tennessee Titans, for example. They brought in Brian Callahan, and then Brian Callahan was part of the regime that brings in Cam Ward, and unfortunately that just didn't work out. That you're then going to have to find a head coach that can work with Cam Ward, and if you can't work with the Cam Ward, then you scrap that Cam Ward and you find another quarterback. But the idea, though, was that Brian Callahan and Cam Ward would be going off into the sunset for the next 5 to 10 years. You cannot go into drafting a young quarterback knowing for certain that the head coach is not going to be around for a long time. Like, you to your point, that's malpractice. You can't do that. That is completely flubbed on the Raiders' part if they do decide to do that. When you bring in a guy like Tom Brady in ownership, like, you would think that Tom Brady has seen enough football and has been around enough football and has experienced enough football to know what the right path forward would be. Maybe we need to have a Tom Brady conversation.
Everything that's happening right now, every single thing that's happening for the Raiders, Tom Brady has had some hand in. And as much as the world's going to blame Mark Davis, and I understand why, he's been a bad owner for a long time for this team, I will remind the world that part of his solution was giving an ownership stake to Tom Brady to fix it. And we see so far how that's going.